The waiting is over. The war on Saddam has begun.
Because we're all being told to evacuate this hotel immediately. We'll talk to you later.
Finish that. The developments are happening very, very swiftly.
These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Saddam himself the target as war begins. Gas alerts in Kuwait as Iraq responds with Scud missiles. America and Britain promise it's only the beginning.
We've been left with no option but to use force.
And here, protesters demand the action be stopped.
The ITV Lunchtime News with Nicholas Owen.
Hello. The waiting is over. The war on Saddam has begun. Just before 3 o'clock our time this morning, the air raid siren sounded in Baghdad. And that eerie sound signalled the first airstrikes of the campaign. And then the sight that the Iraqi people were dreading. However, despite those dramatic pictures, it wasn't the relentless bombardment by waves of Allied planes and missiles that was expected. Instead, limited strikes, some launched from warships in the Gulf and what America is calling leadership targets in the suburbs of Baghdad, taken to mean Saddam Hussein himself and those around him. British ground forces haven't been involved yet, but they have been caught up in several gas attack alerts. They were false alarms, but Iraqi Scud missiles have hit northern Kuwait. And we've heard in the last few minutes that British Harriers have taken off to attack Scud missile sites. Today, and for the rest of the conflict to come, I'll be here with a specially extended ITV Lunchtime News to bring you the very latest on what's happening. Our first report today is from Baghdad, and John Irvine, who's there.
The portent of war. But if the siren was meant to clear the streets of Baghdad, it wasn't needed. That had happened hours before. Soon came the sound of thunder. But of course it wasn't, for this was a man-made storm. Using an image intensifier on one of our cameras, we could pick out exploding AK shells in the pre-dawn sky. The first American salvo appeared to have been directed at targets on the southern edge of Baghdad. Here you can make out a huge column of smoke following a cruise missile strike. In the city centre, the Iraqi gunners were blazing away. Those are their muzzle flashes.
This war has started with a precision strike by the Americans on targets south and west of Baghdad. But most of what we've heard this morning has been Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. It does seem the gunners are rather trigger happy.
If the raid was an attempt to kill Saddam Hussein, the Iraqis moved quickly to indicate failure. He appeared on television to read a defiant statement. Saddam Hussein gave today's date, but it's impossible to say whether the recording was made before or after the raid. When silence returned to Baghdad, some of its residents soon emerged. They have plenty of experience when it comes to air raids, and they know what happened this morning is just a foretaste of things to come. John Irvine, ITV News, Baghdad.
And John Irvine joins me now. John, the conflict has begun, but not in the way that people anywhere, particularly in Baghdad, I guess, were expecting.
No, I mean, the people of Baghdad are experienced in these things, having been bombed before, 91, 93 and 98. This was not the ferocious initial assault that they had expected. And I don't know whether you can hear, but there are plenty of cars in the street behind me. People have been confident enough to come out here today. Air raids in daylight, of course, have been rare through the years. I think that's part of why these people have come out onto the streets this afternoon. We expect them to disappear quite soon. As soon as dusk falls, I think Baghdad will be a largely deserted city when it comes to the streets.
We're going straight now to Kuwait City, I believe. John Stapleton. John, I gather dramatic developments there.
Yes, for the third time this morning, Nick, and you've just missed it, we've had air raid sirens going. We are now being told that for the third time this morning we have to evacuate this hotel. I have to put this gas mask on, as I tried to a little bit earlier with you. It is very, very difficult indeed. You've got literally 9 seconds to put this on. But like this morning, I knew I had my gas mask with me, but where was it? I couldn't remember. Imagine what it's like if you're waking up in the middle of the night, you're half asleep, trying to find your gas mask, and then trying to do this, which is what you've got to do, and then tighten it all up. And then having done that, in this case, we've now got to run down 14 flights of stairs to get to the bunker downstairs. And I'm sorry, Nick, but we're having to go now because we're all being told to evacuate this hotel immediately. We'll talk to you later.
Finish that. Right, we have to leave, as you can see, from Kuwait there. We were hoping to go back to Baghdad, but we can't do that either at the moment. Developments are happening very, very swiftly. As you can see, we'll keep you up to date with all of them. Thanks to John Stapleton there in Kuwait and, of course, John Irvine in Baghdad before him. Now, as we said, British troops haven't been involved so far in any fighting, but they have been at the centre of several chemical attack alerts. Soldiers in Kuwait were forced to scramble for their gas masks when 2 explosions were heard. They were false alarms, but fears of chemical attacks from Iraq are very real. 2 Scud missiles hit Kuwait's northern border this morning. Here's Lawrence McGinty.
Come on! It was what everyone feared, a reprisal attack with chemical weapons by the Iraqis. British soldiers and reporters hustled into protective masks and clothing as the alarm sounded less than 7 hours after the opening shots of the war. In the end, it was a false alarm, but real enough to the soldiers there.
I don't know how close they were, and I don't know what they were, but the call came to gas up, and that's our first real drill.
So you see the importance of having your kit
on
your back.
Boots,
In Kuwait City, the sirens sounded twice this morning after Iraqi missile attacks into Kuwaiti territory. Soldiers were quick to put on protective clothing, as were civilians and reporters who had any. In the end, there was no attack on the Kuwaiti capital, but fear of an assault with chemical weapons is palpable. Reporters like ITV's Martin Geisler were forced to wear gas masks during their reports.
More air raid sirens sounding by the minute. There is about a 3-minute blast on this air raid siren, then a minute's pause, then another 3-minute blast.
Iraq kept 20 Scud missiles since the last conflict a decade ago. Reports today suggest 5 were fired at Kuwait. ITV reporters confirm that 2 of those were shot down by batteries of Patriot ground-to-air missiles like these. No doubt this is not the last time troops in northern Kuwait will face a possible chemical or biological attack. Reprisals seem certain, as long as the Iraqis have the means and the will to fight back. Lawrence McGinty, ITV News.
Just 45 minutes after the first cruise missiles began raining down on Baghdad, President Bush went on television to announce to America and the world that the attacks had begun. He said it was the start of what will be a concerted campaign to disarm Iraq and free its people. Here, the Foreign Minister Jack Straw said this morning there'd be no option but to use force. Sue Saville reports.
Before dawn broke, up to 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from 4 American warships and 2 submarines positioned in the Gulf and the Red Sea. Nighthawk F-117A stealth fighters were sent out on sorties, dropping bunker-busting, precision-guided bombs. This morning, multi-role F-18 Hornet aircraft landed safely back on board the USS Milius. Missions accomplished. Radar-jamming Prowler aircraft had also been sent out, supporting the stealth fighters. On the USS Constellation, hundreds of bombs are lined up, ready for future bombing raids. The battle group commander spoke of the air sorties so far.
They had nothing to do per se, the strikes, with anything else that was going on today other than to continue to prep the battlefield, to clear a path for further on airstrikes and ground operations, not unlike what we've done before.
Soon after the action began, President Bush spoke live on television.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases, to help with intelligence and logistics, to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
In London this morning, the Cabinet was summoned for a war briefing. The Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, later admitted the government expects Iraqi civilians will die.
War is unpleasant. War should only ever be a last resort. There will be innocent civilians killed in this military action, and we cannot resile from that or use euphemisms to cover up that reality. But what we say is that the number of Iraqi lives saved by this military action will far exceed the number of people who sadly will be killed.
The French President Jacques Chirac warned of serious consequences for the future, whatever the duration of this war. The military action started by American forces has been condemned by the Russian President Vladimir Putin as in no way justified. Putin called for a swift end to hostilities. But according to America and Britain, the battle has only just begun. Sue Saville, ITV News.
Well, I'm joined now by our correspondents in Downing Street and in Washington. To Downing Street and John Ray first. John, the latest from there we've heard, haven't we, from the Defence Secretary this morning? We've heard from the Foreign Secretary this morning.
We've heard within the past few minutes from Jeff Hoon speaking just down the road in the House of Commons and telling MPs that although he hopes, as most people do, that this will be a swift war, to make no assumptions on the duration of this war at all, I'm afraid. Here in Downing Street, a very business-like atmosphere. We're told a very sombre, a very serious meeting, as you would expect of the War Cabinet this morning, but also, strange to say, perhaps an air of business as usual as far as is possible. Tony Blair leaves Downing Street this afternoon for a summit with fellow European leaders in Brussels, planning to stay overnight. Certainly, I don't think we'll hear anything from the Prime Minister until British forces are formally committed in the main assault, whenever that comes. Also noticeable that Downing Street, whenever you ask them any question about the timing of this main assault, they say make no assumptions, they get tetchy. We're not going to provide a running commentary on the timing of events.
John, and some words from the Queen today?
Yes, within the past few minutes we've had a statement issued on behalf of Her Majesty from Buckingham Palace, in which she says the following. She says to the troops now committed in the Gulf, may your mission be swift and decisive, your courage steady and true, and your conduct in the highest traditions of your service. My thoughts are with you and the family and friends who await you.
John Ray in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. Let's go now straight to Washington and Robert Moore. Robert, President Bush, last night, how would you describe him? The word that comes to mind for me is resolute.
I think that's right, certainly resolute, and making crystal clear to the American people this would not be a war of half measures. This would be a war involving the full resources of the American military. What is absolutely intriguing here today are the details of what is the US assassination attempt, in essence, of Saddam Hussein. We now know at about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon the head of the CIA, George Tenet, went into the Oval Office and said to President Bush, we know where Saddam Hussein is. He's not in a palace, he's in a private house, and we know he's going to be there for several hours. In the intelligence community, they call this actionable intelligence. They knew where he would be, and they knew he was staying there. And on that basis, President Bush issued the orders to try and kill him with a combination of several dozen cruise missiles. He also ordered 2 F-117 stealth aircraft in the air to launch some bunker-busting bombs. So a really serious attempt to kill Saddam Hussein there based on real-time intelligence. Of course, we now believe it has failed, although for a while after that address by Saddam Hussein, apparently CIA officials believed it might not be Saddam Hussein, but one of his doubles. So some confusion in the intelligence community. Clearly a very daring, very audacious attempt to kill Saddam Hussein in the opening shots of the war.
Well, Robert Moore in Washington, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're now able to go, I think, to the Kuwaiti desert, where our correspondent Geraint Vincent is to be found. There he is, yes, via video phone, which explains why our pictures are not quite as perfect as we would like them to be. Geraint, you've had a very dramatic morning there, haven't you?
Yeah, we have. We've been subject to 5 gas alerts here in the camp of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, which means that we've been getting our gas masks on, our protective clothing on, and getting into our tents every time one goes off. And I should say that if we do get another alert while this broadcast is going on, then it will come to an abrupt end. But with me for the moment, at least, is Captain Fred Gray, who's the adjutant of the 1st Battalion here. Fred, it's been a testing morning, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, it wouldn't be fair, or with events over the last 12 hours. Clearly, people have been following that in the media. As you said, we've had to respond to a number of alerts, but actually, routine is carried on. One of the things that we've been doing since we've been out here is making sure that we can respond if something happens, and that has happened this morning, and we've responded.
And the paratroopers that you're in charge of, Fred, are trained and are ready to go about whatever operation they're asked to in this fully protective gear.
Yes, they are. I mean, half the battle of working in this sort of environment is being mentally prepared for it. One of the things that we've been doing since we've been out here is doing physically and mentally demanding training, realistic training. So should it be required to be put into action, then we can do that. I'm not suggesting for one moment it is easy, but actually the preparation has been good and the guys are ready to do whatever they have to do.
On that point, how firm an indication have you been given that the Parachute Regiment will have some involvement in any operation which could be about to start in Iraq?
I think the clearest indication that we would have a role to play is the very fact that we're here. We're part of 16 Air Assault Brigade, which by definition is a very potent, capable organisation. We have been spending time training, taking into account all the potential missions that we may be given and making sure that we're ready for any of those should that be required.
OK, Captain Fred Gray, thanks very much for joining us. I'll let you go. I know you've got a lot to be getting on with. That's all from Northern Kuwait from here. For now, Nick, back to you in the studio.
Geraint Vincent via video phone. Thank you very much. Geraint there with the paras in the Kuwaiti desert. The way the war started today was, as we've said, a surprise. No relentless bombing, in the military's own words, to shock and awe the Iraqis. But what do we know about the tactics and weapons that were used last night? Well, in a moment I'll be speaking to John Nichol, a veteran of the First Gulf War, who will be with me throughout the conflict with a guiding hand and help with some of the technical terms and much other things as well. But anyway, first we're going to go to Lauren Taylor, who has our daily, it will be daily from now on, Lauren, lunchtime briefing.
Thanks, Nick. Well, this wasn't the massive aerial onslaught that many had expected to mark the start of the war. Instead, a very limited strike against what the US is calling a target of opportunity. So were last night's attacks targeted against Saddam Hussein himself? The United States says they pinpointed the most senior figures of the Iraqi leadership. That could include Saddam, his sons and key advisors. The hope could be to paralyse the Iraqi high command and cause panic and upheaval in the government. So let's look at one of the key elements of last night's attack, the Tomahawk cruise missile. 36 were used last night. It flies long distances to attack targets with immense accuracy, hugging the landscape to avoid being shot down. Using advanced guidance systems, it maps its exact position so it doesn't steer off course. That, combined with stealth fighters using bunker-busting bombs, would seem to be the perfect weapons to launch a covert strike to kill Iraq's leaders in the first moments of the war. Well, if the US was trying to kill Saddam, what targets might they have tried to hit? The first blast seemed to come from the southern and eastern suburbs of Baghdad. Plenty of potential targets there. One of which could have been the Rashid military airbase here in the east of the city. Explosions later hit the city centre. Many key ministries based there, including the Ministry of Defence, the Intelligence Ministry, and Iraq says the state television station was hit. However, US officials say despite the attempt to neutralise the Iraqi leadership, they haven't targeted any of the presidential palaces. So the first night of the war defied all predictions. One thing is clear, though, there'll definitely be more surprises as the campaign unfolds.
Well, with me throughout the conflict will be John Nichol, the former RAF navigator whose plane was downed in the first Gulf War. John, as Lauren was just emphasising, the first night, a real surprise.
Very much of a surprise. I think that many of us had gone home at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking that it simply wasn't going to happen. The Pentagon over the last few weeks have been talking up the first night of the bombardment. Shock and awe were the phrases that they were using. 3,000 guided weapons raining down on Baghdad. And of course, none of that happened. Two reasons for that. Is it because they were caught off guard with this new intelligence that said where Saddam Hussein was? Or is it part of the policy to try to confuse things? Of course, nobody in the military wants to tell either the media or the people in Iraq what the battle plans are.
Opportunistic, do you think? What was it, a case of intelligence people somewhere suddenly saying, hey, we think we know where Saddam is? Was President Bush, as the commander-in-chief, we must remember, of US forces, pushed into doing something?
I think there's absolutely no doubt, listening to what's been said already today, that this was purely intelligence-led. They knew where at least the leading people in the Iraqi regime were, and they had to take that opportunity to try to get them, to try to cut the head off the snake in many ways. And that, in many ways, forced the hands of the Pentagon. We then had to say the war has now started, and I'm not sure if that was ever going to be the plan, if it was meant to start that way.
Well, John Nichol, thank you very much indeed. We'll be speaking to you a little bit later in the programme. Well, I'm joined now by the Cabinet Minister Peter Hain. Mr. Hain, how would you describe the mood this morning among Cabinet members?
Very sombre and very sober, and taking up the responsibility to ensure that Saddam Hussein is disarmed, that he can't inflict his murderous weapons of biological, chemical, and in the future potentially nuclear weapons, either on his neighbours as he's done in the past, or on his own people, or on the rest of the world.
Now, would it be fair to say that the British government, along with most of the rest of us, were rather caught on the hop by what the Americans did last night?
No, not at all. The Defence Secretary, Jeff Hoons, made it clear that he was closely involved and consulted. This has all been part of a strategy that the government has decided upon in consultation with and in agreement with the Americans. And the objective all along has been to target the regime, to disable the regime, to disarm the regime, rather than the Iraqi people, whom we're seeking to protect, not just from military action, but from their own tyrant who's ruled them so murderously for so long.
Many people will be concerned to hear that there are Scud missile attacks apparently from Iraq. I think people rather assume that they weren't able to do that. That must be worrying.
Well, we've said all along, Saddam Hussein, whatever the lies he's given to the inspectors and to the world for 12 years now, but particularly for the last 4 months that there's been this focus on it, we've said all along he possesses lethal weapons. He does. People may not have believed us, but we're starting to see the signs that he does have awesome missiles and other equipment with which to attack not just his own people, but our allied forces. And it remains to be seen whether he does use his chemical and biological weapons, because we know he has them. And that is certainly one of the unanswered questions.
And indeed, opposition in the UK not disappeared, of course, Mr. Hain. People protesting right outside the House of Commons at the moment.
Yes, and I understand and respect that. But in the end, the question I have to put to them very directly, as somebody who's organised protests in the past against tyranny, is how can they put themselves in the position, and how can those who disagree with our policy elsewhere internationally put themselves in the position where the United Nations is effectively disabled, is paralysed by a refusal to move forward and agree its own resolutions for 12 years now to rid Iraq and to disarm Saddam Hussein of his weapons of mass destruction. That is the issue.
Mr. Hain, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
The focus this morning may be on the bombs on Baghdad, but in the days to come there will be several other critical areas. Thousands of Iraqi refugees are expected to pour into Jordan. Julian Mannion is just yards away from another of the most heavily fortified zones. That's in northern Iraq. We can go live to him now. Well, Julian, it does sound as though, although the rockets, bombs, missiles aren't actually dropping on you there, you are very close to a front line.
We are at the front line. We are at the eastern approaches to Iraq's second city, that is Mosul, a city which contains about 250,000 Kurdish inhabitants, some of whom may actually rise in revolt against Saddam Hussein if and when the time comes. But between us and them are some 45,000 Iraqi troops dug in on the other side of the river behind me, and we'll try to show it to you. Just behind me is a ridge line you can see in the distance, and on top of that ridge line, which extends in this area for at least 5 miles, there are a whole series of Iraqi bunkers, trenches, fortifications, many of them invisible to the naked eye at this distance, but clearly visible through binoculars, for example. And we can at times actually see Iraqi troops coming out of their trenches and in fact standing around talking. That at least has been the pattern of recent days. Today it must be said that most of them are remaining inside their fortifications, presumably because they don't know when they're going to be attacked. It must be said that when the bombing goes into what is called the shock and awe phase, it's very likely that the defences of Mosul will be among the principal targets.
We saw those military installations very clearly. Thank you for that, Julian. And one other point, of course, the Kurds in that area, they will be very keen indeed to see the downfall of Saddam Hussein. But what would happen next is very difficult to predict, isn't it?
They certainly will be keen to see his downfall. There's an air of great excitement, mixed, it must be said, with a certain trepidation among the Kurdish Peshmerga guerrillas that I've spoken to here. They really want to see Saddam Hussein gone. Saddam Hussein is blamed for the deaths of some 200,000 Kurdish people, and many Kurdish soldiers would like nothing better than to get, for example, to get across the bridge on this river and march on Mosul. That said, they are now under the formal command of US forces, and everything that happens will have to be a joint decision, and therefore at this stage they are being restrained. But they hope to take part in this battle, and they hope above all that the cause of Kurdish autonomy in northern Iraq will be advanced by victory over Saddam Hussein.
Julian Mannion, thank you very much indeed. We also have with us now Tim Rogers. He's on Iraq's border with Jordan. Tim, I understand that they are preparing there for the effects of war.
Yes, they are indeed, Nick. I can tell you that literally 20 miles down this makeshift road is Iraq. We're as close as we can get at this moment to the border, and this is where the refugees are coming. And over to the other side, you might be able to see some of the construction process which is going on here, where they're literally having to harvest rocks because the wind is so intense here that they need those rocks to keep these tents in place. This is a makeshift camp which is being assembled over the last few days by the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent humanitarian organizations. Now this camp is here primarily for other nationalities who are living in Iraq and who are desperate to get out. And we've seen already this morning groups of Sudanese who've arrived here, who come on these buses you can see behind me. Now, that bus contains a group of students who come out from Baghdad who are anxious to leave. They hope that they will be able to move on from here to Amman, where they might be able to get a flight home. But they're the lucky ones, because in these tents beside me here, there are families who are trying to get some sleep and rest, and they don't have any money, and it looks as if they will have to stay here. They're living at the moment in the middle of a construction site. This is the best hope they have, and this is where they will have to stay for the time being until they can get further assistance.
The wind is blowing like mad. We can hear it. It sounds a really desperate corner of the world, frankly, and dusty, miserable.
I think that just about sums it up, Nick. Yeah, it is about as miserable as it could possibly be. I think there are 70 workers here from the Red Crescent Society who've been trying to put these tents up despite the atrocious conditions. They've had sandstorms in this area for the last few days. Sand which is so fine that it gets into every part of the body, it's hard to see really. It's hard to stand up against and resist this wind. So you can imagine how miserable these conditions are for these people. They're just hunkering down inside these tents, hoping for the best. But most of them have given up everything they had in Iraq to get to this place, and they've no idea how they're going to get any further. We were talking to a man earlier who had spent the last 15 years building up a small, modest business in Baghdad, but he's had to give it all up because he was so worried about what would happen there. So he's left with his family, and they're in one of these tents with their suitcases piled up around them, not knowing what to expect next or where they can go next. But this, at least, is a safe haven.
Tim Rogers on the Iraq border with Jordan in that, as I said, the only word is miserable place, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. It is now 1 o'clock. We're on air with a special hour-long ITV lunchtime news, as we will be every weekday during the war on Saddam Hussein. That war started early this morning when cruise missiles began raining down on Baghdad. These are the main events so far.
The first American salvo.
Air raid warnings in Baghdad began around dawn and were quickly followed by the deafening explosions of cruise missiles hitting buildings in the city. Some 40 missiles were fired at Baghdad. They were launched from F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter bombers and American Navy ships in the Gulf. British troops have been at the centre of several chemical attack alerts, although they haven't been involved in any fighting. 2 Scud missiles hit northern Kuwait, and there have been several air raid alerts in Kuwait City. Less than an hour after it had all started, President Bush went on television to say the campaign had started, as he said, to disarm Iraq and free its people. Here, the Defence Minister Jeff Hoon said this morning's attacks had been specifically targeted at senior Iraqi leaders. Well, for the very latest on the war on Saddam, I'm joined now by correspondents covering all aspects of the conflict. We go first to John Irvine, who is in Baghdad. I hope. No, we don't have John Irvine. I'm sorry about that. We can see him, but he's not ready for us. But I do think we have GMTV's John Stapleton. He is there. Good. John, earlier on, you were starting to demonstrate gas masks to us. Then you had to evacuate. It's an extremely edgy day there, isn't it?
Very, very edgy day indeed, Nicholas. Relative calm returned, at least for the time being, following that air raid warning which truncated our conversation half an hour ago, and the third air raid warning here in Kuwait this day, following an attack by 2 Scud missiles launched by Iraq, both of which we are told were taken out by Patriot missiles, although we have had reports of at least 3 other Scud missiles landing as well. One of them, it was alleged, in a Kuwaiti suburb, but we don't have confirmation of that yet. If that is the case, I have to tell you, Nick, that will come as a matter of great shock and great concern, not just to the 2 million Kuwaitis who live here in this desert kingdom, but also to the expats. The ones I've been talking to in the last week or so did not expect an attack on Kuwait, certainly not at this stage. They thought if Saddam Hussein was going to do anything like that, that would be a part of his last hurrah, as it were, when he was cornered, not on the first day of a conflict. But it's interesting, Nick, looking behind me, this is what they call the Gulf Road here in Kuwait City. Normally that's very, very busy with traffic. It is almost completely deserted of traffic and has been for most of the day. So I assume Kuwait is staying indoors very, very wisely indeed, in case of yet further attack.
John Stapleton, thank you very much indeed. And now we go to Robert Moore in Washington. John Stapleton making the point that several of us have, that this wasn't the way things were supposed to go. There was going to be that huge attack on Baghdad, Robert, and nobody really expected a retaliation on Kuwait. All turning out a bit strangely.
Well, that's right, and very dramatic developments there, with the White House and the Pentagon essentially trying to decapitate the Iraqi leadership, assassinate Saddam Hussein with the opening salvo of the war. What we understand is those months of meticulous war planning were essentially ripped up when the CIA director went into the White House and told President Bush he believed he knew where Saddam Hussein was and where he would be for the next few hours. President Bush then launched these cruise missiles and strike aircraft on that target. Now, it's pretty apparent that assassination attempt on Saddam Hussein failed, and what we're expecting in the coming days is perhaps more of that, more attacks on key leadership targets, as well as this systematic preparation of the battlefield in southern Iraq in advance of the major armoured move, that 350-mile armoured thrust up from Kuwait to Baghdad.
Robert Moore in Washington, thanks. Let's go straight now to Baghdad and our correspondent there, John Irvine. John, some mention there of civilian casualties in last night's raid. Do you have any details?
Well, the information minister here in Baghdad has given a news conference. He says a man was killed in an air raid in a town called Rutba near the Jordanian border. He also listed some of the other targets that were hit last night, and he specifically mentioned what he called 2 civilian locations. Now, we think that one of those civilian locations is the house the Americans are talking about as the one that they hit as part of their assassination. In the picture piece that I gave you, there is a large plume of smoke that we feature in the south of Baghdad, and we suspect that may indeed be the assassination attempt. The assassination attempt, of course, we feel failed. It was, as Robert Moore pointed out, an attempt to bring this thing to an end before the war effectively started. Now that that's failed, I think the Americans will target Saddam Hussein's power base, his administration, more extensively.
John Irvine in Baghdad, thank you very much. Once the bombing started, anti-war protesters wasted no time in beginning their own campaign. In a series of protests around Britain, workers have been downing tools and school children have been boycotting classes. The protests have stopped traffic and closed some roads around Parliament Square and Whitehall in London. Here's Catherine Jacob.
Baghdad may be filled with the noise of war, but London's Parliament Square is echoing with the chants of peace this lunchtime. Hundreds of students downing their books to take up banners in protest at the bombings. They staged their sit-in directly opposite the Commons. The message to Mr. Blair, not in our name. For a while they managed to stop the traffic in Whitehall, but police moved them on without too much ado, and though noisy, the protest continued peacefully.
Well, Carol Turner from the Stop the War Coalition is with me in the studio now. Carol Turner, Catherine Jacob reporting there that protesters want to go on right to the end of the conflict. Is that your understanding? All through this war we will have people waving banners and lying down in roads and so on?
Absolutely. This war is not fought in the name of the British people or indeed in the name of the international majority, and we will continue to make that point throughout. You
don't think that you're liable now to be accused of I don't know about disloyalty, but certainly not showing much support for our soldiers out there risking their lives in the Gulf?
I can't speak for what we're going to be accused of, but what I can say is that the best way to protect British troops and other troops out there is to bring them home.
But that's not going to happen, is it? I mean, we must live in the real world. It's quite clear this conflict is going to carry on. No chance of stopping it as such. Shouldn't you perhaps turn your attention to what might happen in Iraq after this is all over?
Well, what's going to be happening in Iraq now is that thousands of innocent civilians, women, children, families, are going to be the principal victims of George Bush and Tony Blair's bombing campaign. And that's where our concern and attention and anger is focused.
And Saddam Hussein hasn't been responsible for misery for thousands of Iraqi people?
The fact that they live in a regime which is a horrible dictatorship does not mean that they want to be bombed to death to be protected from that. The only people who are in a position to change that situation is the Iraqi people themselves. The more that the Western forces step in and destroy their country, the less able in reality they are to do anything about their government.
No.
I do not believe that another government installed by the United States and Britain is going to be acting in the interests of the people.
Carol Turner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We were told just in the preliminary stages of that we are in just the preliminary stages of the campaign and that the real bombardment is still to come. When it does, the B-52 bombers stationed at RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire are expected to play a key role. Security has been stepped up there. Armed police officers are guarding the area. You can see them there. Missiles were loaded onto some of the planes yesterday. Our reporter Chris Shipp is there. Well, now then, Chris, at Fairford, much going on at the moment?
Well, there are 14 US B-52 bombers based here at Fairford. You can see some of the huge planes behind me now. Now, none of those 14 planes were involved in any action overnight or this morning, which obviously ties in with the speculation that last night's attack was all about targeting key senior members of the Iraqi regime. And that's because these bombers will play a heavy role in any air assault on Iraq, that huge intensive air assault we've heard so much about. These planes can carry up to 30 tons of missiles, up to 20 cruise missiles each, and they can be dropped on Iraq within 6 hours of leaving this Gloucestershire airbase as part of that intensive bombing campaign. Now, to give you an idea of what an important role they play, in the last Gulf War in 1991, they dropped some 40% of Allied bombs.
Chris Shipp at Fairford, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, we're some, about 10 hours or so into the conflict, the preamble to a campaign of what America has been calling shock and awe. The real shock is that the extensive bombing the Allied forces are capable of is still to come, it seems. John Nichol joins me again now to give us his thoughts about how it all might unfold. We keep saying this, John, but a very surprising opening to this war. Not the way you would have thought the military people would have liked to have started?
Not the way that anybody expected it to start, and there could be two reasons for that. It could be that the intelligence was so perfect that although perhaps they didn't want to start the campaign for another 24 hours, they had to take the opportunity to try to attack Saddam himself. And if that was the possibility, then obviously they had to try to take that option. The other option, of course, is that they're doing this deliberately to keep up the confusion. And we can see there that we're seeing some of the cruise missiles that were actually launched off the American ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. These cruise missiles have got a range of about maybe 600-700 miles. And so that could take in the order of maybe an hour and a half to get depending on where they were fired, to actually get into the centre of Baghdad.
Now, how do you see this being played out over the next few days, John? I'll ask you one question straight away. Friday, holy day in the Arab world, isn't it? Does that mean to say the Allies would hold off?
Well, I think that's probably an expert on Muslim affairs rather than me. But I can tell you that during the war in 1991, it certainly wasn't a consideration. Of course, I'm wondering that perhaps if this wasn't meant to be the start of the war that we were expecting, we may see a delay before we see any more action. There was no shock, there was no awe this morning. There was a very targeted campaign, and then we've seen nothing from the Allies since 3 o'clock this morning, which is not what we were expecting.
Your experience was in Harriers, wasn't it, very much?
Tornadoes.
Tornadoes. I know my Harriers and my Tornadoes, get them rather away. But we've got some cockpit pictures, I think we can just show very quickly. Yeah, that's what it's like flying around at night. That brings back...
those pictures were taken a few days ago by another RAF pilot in another Harrier, and he's using a simple handheld camera to photograph that Harrier in the no-fly zone.
Well, John Nichol, thank you very much indeed. We'll be hearing more from you later in the programme. Perhaps not later in the programme, I hope so anyway, certainly over the next few days. Well, that's it from me for the moment. We will be handing you over now to ITV newsrooms around the country for the developments where you are. You're watching a specially extended ITV lunchtime news on the day war was launched on Saddam. This is what's happened so far. Bombing began around dawn in Baghdad when cruise missiles started hitting the city. Iraqi guns returned ack-ack fire. Some 40 cruise missiles were launched from American stealth fighter bombers and US Navy ships out in the Gulf. It wasn't the full-scale attack everyone expected, but limited strikes said to be specifically targeting the Iraqi leadership, including Saddam Hussein himself. British ground forces haven't been involved yet, but they've been at the centre of several chemical attack scares. They turned out to be false alarms, but Scud missiles did hit northern Kuwait. In the last few minutes, we've learned that an American Special Forces helicopter has crash-landed in southern Iraq. It's not thought that anybody was killed. President Bush officially announced the war had started early this morning. Now, during the conflict, news at 10 is moving to become the news at 9. And Trevor MacDonald is in the Gulf to present it, and he joins me now. Trevor, we've seen other colleagues dashing for cover, putting on their gas masks. It's been a difficult day there, hasn't it?
It's been a fairly difficult day, Nick. We've done that twice ourselves, but I suppose it's been more traumatic for the Kuwaitis, who remember very clearly what happened in 1990 and are very, very worried about anything to do with what Saddam Hussein might do to their city-state. So yes, it's been very traumatic. If you look outside, as I think you heard John Stapleton say earlier, the streets are fairly deserted. People are indoors listening to their radios and watching their televisions and hoping that the worst which they fear does not actually happen.
Now, have you been able to pin down what American strategy is all about in these early stages?
Well, Nick, what I can tell you, what I have learned is that this is definitely not the beginning of the salvo that we expected. This is not the start of some 3,000 missiles which are going to rain down in the first few hours on Baghdad. What might have happened is that American intelligence sources put about a rumor that Tariq Aziz was about to leave the country, knowing that he would respond to this by coming out of the bunker, wherever he is, making calls to his family and his friends and relations, saying this is nonsense. And in fact, this is precisely what he did. Now, the fact is that they were tracking him back to the bunker, and that is where I think those attacks were meant to hit. And I think they weren't aimed at Tariq Aziz, but probably at Saddam Hussein himself.
Trevor MacDonald, we look forward to seeing you on News at 9. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll be back tomorrow with another extended lunchtime news. We will start at our usual time of 12:30. You can continue to monitor the Iraq situation on the ITV News channel. Goodbye.